All right. Well, thank you so much. And let me start by reflecting that one thing that I think distinguishes this paper, and one thing I've really enjoyed about this whole set of presentations, is the richness of the data that folks in this room have collected. And I'm not going to have such rich data. I'm going to have really long data, but not very wide data. So one thing that I'm really excited about in presenting this work to you is the possibilities that will be unlocked once we release this data, and it can be used in complement to all the rich data that you've all collected. And so, really preaching to the choir in terms of the value of common data elements. So I'm going to be talking about a new database to measure the association between income, race, and mortality. And the standard disclaimers apply that these are my views, not those of the Census Bureau, not those of any federal agency. And so this is work that, this is just a part of our team, working with Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, John Friedman, and Maria Polyakova, and really a fantastic team of undergraduates, pre-doctoral researchers, and postdoctoral researchers. And the context is perhaps not necessary in this room, but I think COVID-19 is important not just in its own right, but also for the fact that it attracted a lot of people's attention to things that many of us were already interested in understanding. The racial disparities that pre-existed the pandemic and the ways in which COVID-19 exacerbated those disparities, not just through the COVID infections themselves, but through the non-COVID health effects and the economic effects, as Bruce was talking about. So we have a handful of goals in this project, and I won't dwell here too long. We want to publish this database, breaking down mortality rates by age, income, race and ethnicity, gender, and county. I'm going to be talking about a lot in AIM 2 today, which is characterizing the short-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on mortality rates in the United States by race and income. So we've got the data from 2020 here today, but I think one thing that we are most excited about as the data becomes available is to start to understand the long-term effects of the post-pandemic changes in health behaviors, labor income, tax and transfer policies, and behaviors on racial and socioeconomic inequality and mortality. So the idea here is that even as excess deaths caused by a COVID infection decline through 2022 and 2023, as most people get vaccinated, there's still many long-term consequences, and the extent to which those inequalities remain persistent or perhaps converge back to smaller levels, I think remains to be seen as an empirical question. So today I'm going to be talking about this work in progress, seeking to better understand the link between income, race, and health, and I'm going to focus on two key questions. The first is how much of the racial gap in life expectancy can be explained by these differences in income and how that's changed over time. So I'm going to start with a bit of context, bringing us from 2001 to the year 2019, before we get to question two, which is how did the impacts of COVID-19 differ across Americans of different races, ethnicities, and incomes. So I'll start today, just as an outline, I'll start with a little bit of data and methods, because I think that's perhaps where the value is greatest. So I'll spend a bit of time here, and then we'll talk about the history pre-COVID and delve into the COVID-19 pandemic. So the data we're working with is a linkage between the 100% sample of census respondents, from which we're getting demographics, including race and ethnicity, linked to the 100% sample of tax returns, from which we can observe people's incomes, whether they file or if they don't file, as long as they receive information returns like W-2s from their employer. And we can also see people's location from their tax returns. And finally, we get the Social Security death records, mortality linked in with this data, and put that together, we get anonymized data on pretty much every American aged 30 to 95 between 2001 and 2020. So that's a total of about 2.5 billion person-year observations. And what I don't see is all the interesting things that you've expended enormous efforts gathering about these people. And so I'll be presenting a granular but high-level overview of what has happened in the last 23 years. So our goal here in this paper is to estimate the expected age of death conditional on someone's income, their race and ethnicity, and their gender at age 30. And so we're basically extending this notion of a period life expectancy, where we take a hypothetical individual who's experiencing the cross-sectional mortality rates at a given point in time, and we're extending that to incorporate income as well. So we say, what if you experience the cross-sectional mortality rates of people with the same income percentile as you? And so if we just look at this in 2019, so here we're looking at pre-pandemic data, and we plot these mortality rates, you can see that a smooth cubic spline does a very nice job of summarizing some of the noise, smoothing it away, and illustrating the shape of mortality in the United States pre-pandemic. So what we're going to do is we're going to smooth across age. We're also going to smooth across income. So we're using a tensor product spline. You can think of that as we assume that 59-year-olds are similar to 60-year-olds. We assume that the 59th income percentile is similar to the 60th income percentile. And that allows us to really get this data from these really small cells of the number of people who are in a specific income percentile at a specific age in a given year. And so that's how we summarize this data. And then using these smooth mortality rates, we're going to calculate life expectancies, period life expectancies in every year from 2001 to 2020. And so what do we learn prior to the pandemic? Losing my time. There we go. So let's start just with 2001 and illustrate the gap between white men and Black men. And let me try to hide this so that you can see more. Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. So that we are not obstructing your view. Okay. So I want to draw your attention to two things. One is this pretty significant gap between the longevity of white Americans and Black Americans in 2001. And second, and I think most strikingly, is the consistency across the income distribution. So no matter what your position is in the national distribution of income, Black men are living about 1.5 fewer years on average than white men in 2001. Now, if I just fast forward to 2019, we see a very different pattern where there's been enormous convergence over those 19 years. So by 2019, there's actually Black American men at the bottom of the income distribution are living slightly longer than white American men. And that's largely due to this enormous improvement in longevity for Black men. And at the top of the income distribution, both white and Black men have experienced pretty substantial improvements in longevity. There's still a slight advantage for white men, but on the whole, averaging across the distribution, there's actually very little gap between the average longevity of Black men and white men of the same income in 2019. So one way that we can sort of summarize this is to say, what if we were to reweight the income distribution of Black men to match the income distribution of white men? And what we see if we do that is this steady convergence over the course of those 19 years, and basically the elimination of that gap conditional on income by 2019. Now, that's not to say that we've achieved racial equality by any means. If we are not doing that reweighting, we see the fact that there's still enormous gaps in income across racial groups and enormous gaps in longevity across racial groups. It's what the reweighting really tells us is that if you take two people of the same income, on average, they have similar longevity in 2019. So we can do the same thing for multiple racial and ethnic groups. We can do the same thing for women, and we see the exact same patterns. And that's going to be consistent across everything I look at here, where we see very similar patterns over time for women and for men. That's going to persist in the COVID period. Let's focus on COVID-19, and I'm going to spend my time there when I start to disaggregate by race and ethnicity. So for starters, if we just look at the effect of COVID-19 on period life expectancy for different income groups, you can see, I think, something that comes as no surprise to the people in this room, the enormous disparity in the effect of COVID-19 between wealthy Americans and lower income Americans. So the decline in life expectancy was gigantic at the bottom of the income distribution, almost 3 whole years in 2020. and more modest at the top of the income distribution. And I think that's actually something that's quite meaningful when you put this in the historical context. Let me skip ahead one slide here to put that in historical context. So if you plot 2001, 2019, and 2020 life expectancies, what you see is that the pandemic really set back rich Americans by a matter of years. Their life expectancy in 2020 looked a little bit like their life expectancy in, say, 2015. Whereas for lower income Americans, their life expectancy in 2020 looked like nothing they had experienced in the last decade or two in the United States. So I find that temporal comparison really meaningful in telling me that the impact of COVID was actually quite small compared to these baseline inequalities that we had across the United States. And moreover, the trend was that COVID had a so much larger effect on the more vulnerable populations in the United States. Going back to the slide that I skipped over, of course, those effects were largest for older Americans, and that was true across the income distribution. So here we're looking at people's incomes at working ages. So we're characterizing people before they retired, were they in the 30th or the 95th income percentile? And I think this is another important finding, that the disparities in the socioeconomic disparities in mortality are not simply associated with, say, frontline work, but even those who have retired, but who had lower incomes during their working years are exposed to much higher incidence and death from COVID-19. So if we look across the income distribution and we pool all races and ethnicities, we see this really stark slope where the life expectancy decline in 2020 was about 2.5 years near the bottom of the income distribution and only 1 year near the top. And that becomes even more stark if you then further break down by race and ethnicity. So here we're looking at that slope, that inequality for white Americans. If we look at Black Americans, the richest Black Americans in 2020 experienced similar life expectancy declines to the very poorest white Americans. For Native Americans, once again, even more inequality. That slope is steeper, and it is everywhere below both Black and white Americans. And one thing that struck me is that if you look at the levels of life expectancy for Hispanic and Asian Americans, they're typically, on average, have longer life expectancies than white Americans. But the COVID-19 pandemic still hit harder in those communities and caused greater inequality. And so you really see the intersection of income, socioeconomic status, and race and ethnicity in those initial consequences of COVID-19. And so if we continue that reweighting, what we see is that COVID-19 in 2020 set back almost 2 decades of progress in the racial equality of longevity in the United States. And I think, as I foreshadowed, the big question in my mind is what has happened since then? Are we able to snap back to a more equal society that is still not equal, but more similar to 2019? Or are many of the changes that happened in 2020 going to persist and continue to affect the longevity of more disadvantaged communities? And I suspect, I have my suspicions, but I will wait for the data as well so that I can show this to you in my next talk. So our next steps, I think we have 2 key open questions. One is about the mechanisms, and I suspect we're not going to be the only ones answering this. I suspect as we publish this data, we'll be working with some of you to answer these mechanistic questions of what was driving the disparate impacts of COVID-19 by race and income, and that's especially so among retired individuals. And then the second question is how this changed. In 2022 and onward, when excess mortality fell, to what extent did those disparities reconverge a little bit? And to what extent are they persisting at elevated levels? And so in our current ongoing work, we're studying these issues both by disaggregating by geography and then working on disaggregating along other dimensions. So we're working very hard, do not yet have the cause of death data, but we would love to have the cause of death data to start to, especially as we look at the persistence, ask what are the mechanisms behind a persistent source of disparity. So we're very excited to finish this database and put it in your hands by making it publicly available. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.